Hey folks, Jim here with Science Talk. I want to discuss with you this article that was just published on 9th of March of 2022, and it contains very troubling findings and is, of course, published in Geophysical Research Letters. And the article is titled Responses of Horizontally Expanding Oceanic Oxygen Minimum Zones to Climate Change Based on Observations. In other words, oceanic oxygen minimums, those zones, those regions are increasing, getting bigger, and it's due to climate change. And they're saying this based on actual observations, actual measurements. Okay, let's take a look at the abstract. Due to climate change, global oceanic dissolved oxygen, DO, has been decreasing, and oxygen minimum zones, OMZs, have been expanding. Here we estimate the annual global and regional OMZ areas using geostatistical regression combined with Monte Carlo. That's the type of statistical procedure. From 1960 to 2019, annual global OMZ 20. Now, OMZ 20 is oxygen minimum zones where the dissolved oxygen content is less than 20 micromoles per kilogram. And then OMZ 60, again, oxygen minimum zones where the dissolved oxygen levels are less than 60 micromoles per kilogram. Okay? So these, from 1960 to 2019, basically a almost 60-year record. Those areas covered 5% to 14%, 15% to 32% of the global ocean, respectively. Okay. The global and most regional OMZ areas after the late 2000s were all significantly larger. Highlight that. Significantly larger than those in previous years. Most oceanic regions likely experienced significant expansions in oxygen minimum zone areas, especially the North Pacific. We'll get back to that as we go through this article here. North Pacific. However, the equatorial Pacific, with the largest OMZ area, showed insignificant horizontal expansion. Basically, when you get to the right on tropical latitudes, there's not much productivity happening anyway, because you have almost a near year-round thermocline. So no productivity. Yeah, the oxygen is already low. So it really, this is not a surprising result. In other words, this is what I would expect. That since that area already is low in oxygen, low in DO, plus it's warmer, right? Warmer waters, the solubility decreases. So I would not expect to see, the DO zone increase too much more. The expanding OMZ areas of most oceans responded more quickly and effectively to the surrounding sea temperatures than to the sea surface temperatures. Okay, this is interesting. To the sea temperatures, they responded more quickly. Okay, we know that gas solubility decreases with an increase in water temperatures. But what's going on at the sea surface? Well, sea surface, you already have the atmosphere oceanic interface. You have wave actions. You have mixing. So you're going to mix in some of the atmospheric oxygen into the water. Even if the water is warm, because of the mixing, you can increase the gas levels. If you took the same temperature water and go several, 10 or 20 meters down, then you would expect to see a decrease in oxygen level for that temperature because the mixing has been removed. So that's basically what they're saying, and they'll get to this point later on in the article, basically saying that you have the mixing at the air water interface. Our research highlights the need for marine resource management to account for the challenges from OMZs. Okay, plain language summary: expanding oxygen minimum zones. OMZs, DO zones in the open oceans have been the topic of intense interest. However, annual OMZ areas trends in OMZ areas, trends in OMZ areas, and causes of OMZ expansions remain unclear. Our paper explores the locations and annual areas of global and regional OMZ areas based on observations over that 60-year period. Over the last 6 decades, annual global OMZ, less than 20 micromoles per kilogram, and OMZs less than 60 micromoles per kilogram areas cover 5% to 14% for the 20, 15% to 32% for the 60 of the global ocean, respectively. The global OMZ areas show great interannual variability, but remain stably large after the late 2000s. Most oceanic regions have experienced significant OMZ expansion, especially the North Pacific. This is an important sentence. All right, let's go over that again. Most oceanic regions have experienced significant oxygen minimum zone expansion, especially the North Pacific. The equatorial Pacific Ocean had the largest OMZ area, but showed insignificant expansion. It expanded, but not significantly. We just discussed that, discussed why. Subsurface sea temperatures are more associated with the expanding OMZ areas than sea surface temperatures. Okay, and I just explained a reason for that. Increasing sea temperature would substantially increase OMZ areas by the end of the century for the future societal development pathway, what they call the SSP 585 scenario. Understanding how OMZs will change over the long term due to climate change is beneficial for the protection of the marine resources. Okay, so let me go right here, this sentence here. Increasing sea temperature would substantially increase OMZ areas because we know that gas solubility decreases with increased water temperature. And we're seeing what? Increasing water temperature. We're seeing all the heat energy being absorbed by the oceans, 240 zettajoules worth. In my updated ocean heat content video, I showed you that huge blob of heat in the North Pacific. Oh, most oceanic regions have experienced significant OMZ expansion, especially the North Pacific. There you have it. Right? And we see that. So this is basically this is a direct climate change forcing, is what's going on here. Okay, let's look through the intro here. Oceanic oxygen minimum zones, defined as low dissolved oxygen zones, mainly exist in global tropical oceans. OMZs greatly degrade marine organisms' community composition and habitats, as well as change the biogeochemical cycles. And I list a bunch of other researches there. Previous research showed that global OMZs, defined as DO less than 20 micromoles per kilogram, accounted for 1 to 8% of the global ocean area and 0.2 to 7% of the global ocean volume. Okay. Global analysis relying on climate models suggested that open ocean OMZs have been expanding due to climate warming since the mid-20th century. Increasing sea temperature affects DO through different processes and mechanisms, including dissolved oxygen solubility in the ocean stratification, ventilation of seawater, and respiration of consumers, including bacteria, zooplankton, and fish. Okay, let's stop there for a moment. DO solubility, that goes to, increased water temperature, gas solubility decreases. Ocean stratification, you get mixing. Well, you need the mixing. But now if you stratify, you don't get the mixing. And you don't get the productivity, which means the phytoplankton are not creating oxygen that is needed for the consumers. So that's also, and you've heard me discuss this with you before, how the stratification of the ocean is a really bad thing. Ventilation of seawater. Now, ventilation is a term that oceanographers use to basically refer to vertical mixing overturn of the water column, so that you get this big mixing, and it could be from the surface all the way down to the substrate, or some level in between, depending where you're at. If you're in the open ocean or in a shelf region, like a near shelf, a littoral area, epipelagic versus open pelagic, what have you. And then the respirations. Okay, organisms, they require oxygen. Well, then they didn't discuss it or address this in this paper, but there's also a thing called biological oxygen demand, BOD, and typically we see examples of that where you have a lot of nutrient input, you get eutrophication, so you get this basically algal bloom, and they just, it just use up everything, and then because don't forget, plants also respire and they also use oxygen when they're not photosynthesizing. So they'll use up the oxygen and then leaves very high BOD for the other organisms. Usually get a big organism kill. The superposition of different mechanisms makes the attribution of causes and effects on the distribution of oceanic oxygen and OMZs more challenging. And then they go on to say, look at data and so on. Clear observational evidence substantiating concerns about annual or decadal changes in OMZ is lacking. Previous research papers have examined ocean content changes globally, and they list a whole bunch based on observational data sets. Most observation-based studies have documented long-term annual or decadal changes in OMZs, either focused on regional subsets, vertical sections, or certain layers of the global ocean due to insufficient long-term DO observations. Basically, you're going to get some people that will look at certain regions of the ocean, certain layers of the ocean, just to try and create some sort of baseline data set. These studies found that the OMZs in tropical oceans intensified and expanded vertically. That's troubling. Vertically from 1960 to the late 2000s and from the 1970s to the late 2020s. However, there's little agreement over the spatial patterns of oceanic oxygen changes that have occurred over the past several decades. So annual OMZ areas and expansion rates, I was trying to quantify it, remain unclear. Better quantification of trends in annual spatial extents needed. Primary goal of this study is to explore the annual horizontal changes. So here they're looking at horizontal changes versus the vertical changes that have been documented in prior research. And then they wanted to develop, and validate some mathematical quantifiable methods. And they go on to basically start saying, how they did it and so on. Data methodology, they talk a lot of statistics and matrix mathematics. I will leave the URL link in the comments section for those who wish to look through that. We don't need to go through all that. As I said, talk matrices here. So, or matrices. Okay. Let's look at the results. That's kind of the important bit here. And they go on to say that their models are capable of robustly predicting annual global OMZ areas and associated uncertainties. The uncertainties are generally large in the southern hemisphere, where data coverage is poor. Now, I do want to say, they have supporting information, And if I just scoot down here real quickly, the supporting information, they just have some PDF files here. So you can click on that. This is the main one here. And they go into, further detail of the sampling areas and further detail of the analyses that they conducted. What I will say is they busted their asses doing this. They took a lot of samples, and what they did is they took vertical profiles. So they lower the instruments, and as it's going through the water column, it's measuring the oxygen levels. And so on a vertical cast, they have a continual oxygen readout, and they say, oh, the depth at which the lowest value occurred was here. And then they make a note of the lat long, where they were in the ocean, and then, of course, what the depth was. And so they're doing these transects. So you get these transects of basically where the minimum is. And then, of course, you plot it with the physical location using the Latin line. And then you can get plots like these here. So let's open this up here. I'll pull up the caption here. And maybe we can increase this just a wee bit. There. Yeah, that's good right there. Okay, so what do we got here, figure 1? All right, so we have the first panel here, upper left, A, is the mean dissolved oxygen DO minimum. So these are the minimum values, and it's given as micromoles per kilogram. Right, that's the minimum. And so as you can see, the deep blue, it would be the lowest values, and you can see you can see it right here in the North Pacific, and you can see right here in the equatorial Pacific, and also in the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. That's where we see mean oxygen minimums right there. Very high for the Arctic because it's super cold water up there, right? So you can get you're going to get a high DO level there. As you can see, looking at the North Atlantic, you have a little bit of a low spot, off equatorial Africa, the Southern Ocean. It's kind of in this 150 to 200 micromoles per kilogram realm. But this is the surprise. This is the interesting result. Low in the North Pacific, lowest in equatorial Pacific. So now B is the mean dissolved oxygen minimum, the depth at which this occurs. Okay? The depth at which this occurs. And what do we see that is of interest? You get to basically the southern south subtropical going to the Southern Ocean. We're seeing that the minimum is down around about 1,000 meters. And on this surprises me. Actually, it shouldn't. It doesn't surprise me. On the Western Pacific gyre, that you have, again, it's about, looks like 800 to 1,000 meters or so in there. Because you have a strong gyral flow, you've got good, strong mixing. Same thing over here in the North Atlantic. So it would make sense that the oxygen minimum will occur down at depth. Usually, if you have a slowdown of thermohaline flow, any oxygen that makes it down to depth will be utilized. And if you have a slowdown of thermohaline flow, then I would expect these values to decrease, to get smaller for the oxygen minimum. Then perhaps the depth will also, it may actually get a little shallower. That remains to be seen. So then, in panel C, the minimum oxygen trend, micromoles per kilogram per year. Okay. So that's the temporal trend. And then the temporal trend, the same thing, for where the depth occurs in meters per year. From 1960 to 2019, DO dissolved oxygen minimum is lowest in the equatorial oceans and the North Pacific, highest in the Arctic Ocean. Most oceans show decreasing trends in the minimum oxygen, except for the equatorial Pacific and Arabian Sea, because they're already low to begin with. Mean dissolved oxygen minimum depths appear shallower in the equatorial and polar oceans than in the mid-latitude oceans. The largest increase in dissolved oxygen minimum depth occurs in the mid-latitude and southern hemisphere. Mid-latitude, southern hemisphere. That's what they're saying. And what this is showing here is the trend. In other words, how much it's either increasing or decreasing. And as we see here, the dark blue is showing that the oxygen is even getting less and less. So we see that here. It looks like by about 2 micromoles per kilogram per year, somewhere between 1 and 2, most of the ocean. It's interesting that right up here in the Bering Sea, it's about 2 to 3, getting less. And this is interesting because it has been documented that the Bering Sea is warming up and that there's been a shift in the phytoplankton regime from diatoms to coccolithophorids. And I think this is reflecting that. And then this is showing the trend in the depth. So it looks like that the red, as I said a moment ago, means it's getting shallower. So the depth trend is getting shallower, and we see red by about 15 meters per year. The blue, it's getting deeper by whatever, If I look here in the Chukchi Beaufort Sea area, it looks like it's about 5 meters per year, which will probably coincide to what the halocline is doing. That's another discussion. So anyway, this is like the major result, the really important nuts and bolts result of their study. And it's important. Okay. So they go on, our work reveals that mean DO, the minimum DO is non-uniformly distributed. Okay. Varies with latitude, with the lowest oxygen in the equatorial Pacific. EP is equatorial Pacific. AS is the Arabian Sea. BB is the Bay of Bengal, followed by the Northern Pacific Ocean, and the EA, equatorial Atlantic. Generally, the oxygen is depleted more in the equatorial oceans due to high biological productivity and low circulation. I'm going to question that because it's well known that tropical waters actually have low productivity. When you get subtropical, where you get a little bit of the mixing, then you're going to get increased productivity. But if you're talking about right at the equator, no, you're going to have low productivity there. In the Atlantic and the Pacific, the lowest oxygen mainly occur on the eastern side of the ocean because the most poorly ventilated waters are found in relatively stagnant cyclonic gyres. Okay, a little brief word about that. You have major oceanic gyres, and they go in a clockwise manner. Coriolis piles the water up in the middle. You get a downwelling in the middle. But and the same thing over here in Atlantic, right? You got the Gulf Stream here, right? Well, due to physics, due to balancing the Coriolis effect, the wind stress, the pressure gradient, you get what's called western intensification. So that on the western side of the gyres, and that was the Gulf Stream or the Kuroshio current over here. On the western side, you get currents that are narrow, they go deeper, and they book along. They're very fast. By the time it swings over here, it slows down considerably, and it gets shallower, and it gets wider, until then it gets re-amped up by the time it makes its way back over here. So that's kind of what they're basically getting at there in that description. And they go on to say, although the biological productivity is high in the Arctic Ocean has the highest uh, dissolved oxygen minimum among the global oceans. In other words, when you look at the minimum oxygen values from all the oceans and all the sea, the North Pacific, Southern Ocean, North Atlantic, Equatorial Atlantic, Arabian Sea, etc., the Arctic Ocean had the highest oxygen minimum. And this is probably due to the high soluble oxygen in cold water and intensive Arctic cyclones that well mix the water. And then they go on, to say, although the biological productivity is high in the Labrador Sea and the Jin Sea, Greenland, Icelandic, Norwegian Sea, the North Atlantic deep water brings surface oxygenated water into deeper layers, which causes high oxygen minimum in these regions. Kind of what I was trying to allude to earlier when I was talking about, the thermal hailing flow bringing the oxygen to depth until it gets utilized. If you have a slowdown or a stoppage of NADW, AMOC, right, then you're going to basically cause the oxygen minimum to get even lower in value. The oxygen minimum in the Southern Ocean is high likely due to high ventilation. For example, when the North Atlantic deep water upwells in the Antarctic divergence zone. Now, here is the troubling right here. Trends in the oxygen minimum are decreasing in most oceans except the equatorial Pacific and Arabian Sea. That's because they're already low. The decreasing trend is more obvious and significant in regions with higher long-term mean DO minimums, including the North Pole, North Atlantic, Southern Hemisphere. Except for the poles, equatorial oceans with lower dissolved oxygen minimum, the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, equatorial Pacific, equatorial Atlantic, turns to have shallower dissolved oxygen minimum depths compared to mid and high latitude oceans. Shallow dissolved oxygen minimum depths mainly occur inshore and in low and high latitude oceans. The shallowest dissolved oxygen minimum depths occur inshore mainly because water depths in these areas are shallower than that of the open ocean. Well, duh. The deepest dissolved oxygen minimum depths exist in the mid-latitude Southern Ocean, corresponding to the upper circumpolar deep water. The upwelling upper circumpolar deep water around Antarctica shoals the dissolved oxygen minimum depth. Okay, that's reflected here, right? That's reflected with this getting, right? Here's the depth trend. It's getting shallower by, and as you can see right here, 15 meters per year. That's exactly what they're referring to here. And we see the deeper depths, right? Everything that they just described in words, we see right here in this most important figure. As sea temperatures increase in recent years, the oxygen minimum zones also increase and the oxygen minimum values decrease. This is due to declining oxygen solubility, enhancing surface stratification, and or weakening of the ventilation. Conclusions. Our research fills in a knowledge gap, and they basically say due to vertical movement of the oxygen minimum zone, the maximum oxygen minimum zone area can be more globally representative indicator showing the status of deoxygenation than the oxygen minimum zone area at a certain depth. Our results show that the global, oxygen minimum zone less than 60 micromoles, less than 20 micromoles per kilogram expands significantly in horizontal direction, which also confirms the decrease in oxygen of mid-layer ocean. So, what is the summary here? Well, back to our favorite figure. The summary is oxygen levels are decreasing in most of the oceans. The depth at which you find this minimum is going to vary. Typically, where you have good biological productivity, like in subtropical, subpolar areas, the Southern Ocean, North Pacific, North Atlantic, you're going to find this minimum value down at depth. Part of that is if you have vertical, if you have thermohaline flow, it brings the oxygen down to depth. And we see the depth at a minimum in tropical regions, and that's because there's very little vertical movement. The waters are warm, it's shallower, very little biological productivity. Okay. We see the lowest oxygen values in the equatorial Pacific, Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, North Pacific. The trend is, as shown in this panel, the trend is that the oxygen is decreasing. Some places up to 3 micromoles per kilogram per year, decreasing. And thanks to maybe perhaps some upwelling activity, the minimum oxygen level amount is in some places, especially the Southern Ocean, is getting shallower. It's up cases 10 to 15 meters per year. Okay. You notice that it's in the polar regions where we see, you got the Labrador Current here, right? The Jinsea, AMOF forming there. It's in the polar regions where we see, overall, in a general term, the oxygen levels getting shallower. Otherwise, it's either not changing much, maybe getting a little deeper, but overall, except for a spot right in the middle of the North Pacific gyre and the this is the Beaufort gyre. So right in the middle of those gyres there, pretty much the only places where we see any noteworthy trend in the oxygen getting deeper. So what does this mean if the oxygen is getting shallower, the minimum oxygen? Well, that's not going to bode well for organisms. Okay? And they also tell us that the minimum zones are expanding horizontally. Again, all of this means it's not good for organisms. And we can basically trace this to all the warming that humans have caused, the heat, the energy that's been absorbed by the oceans for the past 50 years or so. All this is warming the oceans. That heat energy will diffuse to the atmosphere, and that's another discussion which we have talked about before. But this is going to impact organisms. You're getting warmer waters. Okay? Aquatic organisms need the oxygen to be dissolved in solution in the water. Warmer waters, they can't hold as much oxygen. Those organisms are going to be stressed out, especially homeothermic organisms like the great white shark, marlins, tuna. They have a much higher oxygen demand. They're going to be stressed out. So what happens? Well, the water's getting warmer, with less oxygen. The organisms are going to move to where the water is cooler, where there's more oxygen for them. Now, that could be a poleward direction. That could be or going deeper in the water column. Okay, so they move to the poles or they move deeper. Is there food going to be there? Will they have sufficient food to eat? So, and this is as outlined in this paper, gas solubility, how it decreases with increased water temperature. But if you increase in the water temperature, you're going to increase the stratification of the ocean, which reduces primary productivity, which is less oxygen produced by the primary producers for the organism, not to mention less food. So that's going to impact organisms that way, and the food web in that way. If you have increased stratification, that means there's a decrease in the thermohaline flow, and that means a decrease in oceanic ventilation, i.e. mixing. So all of these factors taken together is leading, to basically ecosystems, marine ecosystems are going to be, they're already stressed out. They're going to be ever more stressed out. That's because the oceans are warming. Oxygen levels are decreasing. This is going to negatively impact organisms. So, I wanted to bring this to you. That's the main, what I consider to be the important points, the important finding, and the implications of what all this means. You've heard me say before, the oceans are dying. Well, we just keep quantifying it, don't we? This is further quantification. Until next time, thank you for your time. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.